And welcome to another live reading. Today is going to be a little different. This was my first story that the main character is already a Christian, is also a dystopian sci-fi. But the thing about Christian fiction is it can take place in any genre, any way. It's basically just up to the imagination. So I hope you enjoy this, and I will go ahead and get started on it. Now, this is going to be divided into two parts. It's one short story, but it is about 17 pages worth of material, about 7,000 words. So just want to give you a little bit of background on this, and now I'll go ahead and get started. This short story is called Singularity of Purpose. Garima Jane didn't know how she got aboard the spaceship, or why its crew appeared to be unconscious or worse. They were in their chairs or on the ground with scorch marks on their backs or chests. There was an object on the ground that reminded Garima of a pistol. She was wearing a helmet with a tinted glass-like face covering, but she could easily see through it. She was in some kind of spacesuit, but didn't remember putting it on. The fallen crew had similar gray and white protective outfits, which made them look overly tall, almost exaggerated in their proportions. The overhead lights were low and flickering. The smooth, obsidian-colored walls had embedded vertical columns of digital readouts using symbols and other markings she was unfamiliar with. She felt nervous, flushed with adrenaline. She worried there could be any number of threats to her on this vessel. Not being able to understand the controls or screens made it even more frustrating. She felt like she should be doing something, anything. She just wasn't sure what. At the front of the cabin was a wide screen with rounded glass-like edges. She believed it was displaying the view ahead of the ship. She recognized the planet in the distance as Earth. An abrupt pressure in her forehead made her squint her eyes. She leaned forward with a growing sense of discomfort and dizziness. There was a moment of weightless disorientation, and when she could see again, she was back at the North Carolina State University lab with her two colleagues. One of them was removing her test helmet. Then both peered at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The team leader, Jared McKenzie, a thin, bald man with a brown goatee and blue eyes, spoke first. "Garima, can you hear me? Are you all right?" Garima drooped forward in her chair and rubbed her temples. The light felt too bright, and everything still seemed a second or two out of sync with her body. "Yes, I can hear you," Garima replied, sounding irritated and tired. "I'll be all right. I just need a minute." She looked around to get her bearings and was glad when Patrice Calhoun helped her stand up. Patrice was a few years younger than Garima, who was 25. Patrice was tall, dark-skinned, and athletic, a fellow graduate student at the university. "What did you see, Garima?" Patrice asked, still helping to steady her. "I was on a ship, some kind of alien craft. I seemed to be the only functional member of the crew," Garima responded, "and the ship was approaching Earth." Jared sat down in a rolling chair and scooted forward to face Garima. He stroked his goatee and looked at her with intense eyes filled with possibilities and unspoken questions. "Do you think you could write a detailed journal of the events?" Jared inquired, grabbing a pen and notepad from a nearby table. He didn't hand it to Garima, but he looked ready to. Garima wiped some sweat from her brow, feeling more stable. She looked at her smartphone by her purse. Its digital clock read 6:45 p.m. Hearing the hum of the air conditioner, looking at the white walls of the small lab with various safety and procedural posters, the unopened boxes of server and other computer components, it all helped her recall the purpose that had led her to this point. She remembered that she had agreed to meet with Jared and Patrice here after her last class. Jared had explained to her that the helmet was supposed to create a virtual environment. "Jared, I think you may have created something different than you intended," Garima said. "What do you mean?" he replied, ready for the critique. He laid the pen and notepad in his lap. I'm no scientist, but I am your friend, and I believe your work is amazing, she continued. I volunteered to test this because it sounded cool and intriguing. Jared thanked her with a humble nod. Could your device possibly tap into not only the test subject, but someone else's mind as well? Garma asked. I don't see how, Jared replied, again stroking his goatee with aplomb. The artificial intelligence I designed should be capable of generating a shifting algorithm only based on what it detects from the subject's brain synapses. Theoretically speaking, what would be the connection with some other mind? What if this helmet is making a bridge between the two? Could the test subject see what the other person is seeing? Garma added. Even if what you're suggesting is possible, Patrice interjected as she approached closer to the two of them, how will we prove that's what's happening? Garma reached over and grabbed the helmet. To do that, I need to go back in. Jared stepped forward and raised his hands in a warning gesture. Whoa, Garma, are you serious? That thing threw you for a loop a few minutes ago, he said emphatically. Your heart rate and blood pressure were rising too quickly. That's why we disconnected you. I'll work on making some fixes before we try again in a day or two. Jared may be right, Patrice agreed. Garma sighed. It was stressful. I thought I'd end up by myself with a virtual view of the mountains or Hawaii or something. Instead, I wound up on some spacecraft with an incapacitated crew. I couldn't read the language on the walls. I had no idea what was going on. But I know what to expect now. I can handle it. If you're right about that other person, wouldn't they be aware that something happened? Patrice considered aloud. How would that affect things? We won't know until we try again, Garma answered. Her friends looked like they sympathized, but weren't entirely convinced. She stood up and pleaded with her eyes. If you're right, Jared, I'm just seeing a virtual environment and no harm done, Garma continued. But if I can confirm that this is real, that I'm seeing through someone else's eyes, well, we can determine what to do from there. I just need a few more minutes in that environment. Please. Jared gently put his hand on Garma's shoulder and viewed her with some lingering worry. Okay, but 5 minutes only. Got it? Garma smiled. Not a second more. Garma sat back down in the chair, donned the experimental helmet, and closed her eyes. She could hear Patrice turning the device back on while Jared tapped keys on his laptop at a nearby table, humming some tune to himself. Garma felt a rushing sensation and then found herself in the control center of the spaceship. Earth looked closer. The rest of the crew was still unmoving. If this is a virtual environment, then taking off my helmet won't do me any harm, she thought. But I need to see if I look like me or someone else. If this is real and there's no air, I guess I'll see how long I can hold my breath. She felt a tingling sensation as she released the two small latches on either side of the helmet and lifted it off her head. There was air, even if it was cold and stale. She turned the helmet around, using its reflective surface to try and look at her face. What she saw was nothing like what she expected. Her face was vertically elongated. Her brown eyes were now hazel and larger than normal. Her light brown skin had more of an orange tint to it. Her hair remained black. She felt her heart pulsating faster and faster in her chest, a result of her fear and shock. It took quite a few seconds before she could coherently think again. Not wanting to hyperventilate, she began to take slower, deeper breaths. It's like this is a different existence. I'm an alternate version of myself, Garma thought. Is the helmet the connection? Did Jared's experimental device somehow tap into the technology in this spacesuit here, wherever here is? She looked down at the helmet in her hands and felt a pang of dread. And what happened when I took off the helmet, she thought. Jared, shut it off. She's convulsing, Patrice shouted. I did when the alarm sounded, he replied in frustration. Take the helmet off. Patrice removed the experimental device from Garma's head, but Garma's eyes were still closed, and she was shaking uncontrollably. Jared took out his phone and called 911 in a panic. Patrice felt Garma's forehead. She's feverish and having trouble breathing, Patrice added. Garma opened her eyes and looked around. She was sweating profusely, but her tremors were diminishing. You are base humans? Garma said, her voice strained and barely above a whisper. Where's the portscape? Garma, you're in the lab. We're getting you some help, Patrice soothed. Hang in there, okay? How do you know my name? You can treat Humani? Her eyes began to widen, as if responding to some physical symptom. Humani? Patrice repeated. Jared, I think she's delirious. The 911 operator said the ambulance is 4 minutes away, he replied. Suddenly, Garma hissed, and a massive seizure enveloped her whole body. Her hands locked and her back arched. Patrice's face was frozen in horror for an instant. Then she snapped out of it and tried to hold Garma in place, but was barely able to. Seconds later, Garma went limp in the chair, her head leaning to one side. Patrice heard herself repeating the word no over and over. Garma's eyes were still open but unresponsive, and she was no longer breathing. Jared rushed over and lowered Garma to the floor. Desperately, he administered CPR until the two paramedics arrived. They continued attempting resuscitation, then used a defibrillator to stimulate her heart, but it was too late. They confirmed that she was dead. Garma put her helmet back on, but aside from pumping in fresh oxygen, nothing else was happening. She tried to will herself to return to her body in the lab, but there was no change. She fought against a growing fear gripping at her heart. Something is very wrong. I should have been able to go back. Jared and Patrice would have tried to pull me out, she said to herself, unless they couldn't. She looked down at her gloved and unusually long fingers. Am I trapped in this body? A long, high-pitched shrill sounded at one of the consoles toward the front of the cabin. She looked up at the view screen and saw the Earth was dangerously close. It filled most of the screen, and the ship did not appear to be slowing. Is this thing on autopilot? Doesn't it have any emergency procedures? She said aloud. Corway Garama Gentios identified, a computerized voice responded. Do you wish to invoke emergency landing protocols? It took a moment for Garma to comprehend that the ship was talking to her in English. Yes, invoke emergency landing protocols. Please select destination, Northmost Keralak or Parisay. She thought the first location sounded like a strange alteration of North Carolina, her home state. The other sounded like Paris, France. Considering she had a 50-50 chance of surviving either way, the decision was relatively easy. Northmost Keralak, she answered. Destination confirmed. Please take a seat and prepare for emergency landing. Energy lattice will activate 10 seconds after protective straps are locked. Garma felt like she was in a dream, but she forced herself to step forward. She moved the incapacitated occupant of the nearest seat onto the floor. Before she sat down, she wanted to know something. Are any of the crew alive besides myself? There was a brief pause before the artificial intelligence responded. Corwick Gentiles is the only life sign on the portscape Mishvar. Even though Garma didn't know any of these people or how they died, she felt bad for them. To her, all life was precious. Realizing that the descent and landing could get perilous, Garma dragged the bodies of the crew to another compartment and sealed the door. Then she took a seat and watched as the chair secured her in place with belt straps across her lap and chest. Then the energy lattice surrounded her with a sparkling red tint. She could see through the view screen that the ship had a similar lattice. As the vessel descended, flames from friction surrounded it, filling the view. Garma's helmet mask darkened automatically to protect her from being blinded by the intensifying illumination. When she was a teenager, her parents had taken her and her sister Zoya to India. It was to show them where their grandparents had lived before coming to America. She remembered being scared of landing during a thunderstorm, though it had all turned out okay. But that plane had experienced pilots. Today there were no pilots, only a machine, and she knew the only way she would survive this was to pray immediately. Lord, please, I know I'm impulsive. Maybe I shouldn't have done this, she said, but I need your help right now. If it's your will, let me survive this. In Jesus' name, the portscape jolted suddenly, banging loudly at atmospheric turbulence, shoving her to the right and back. The next 30 minutes were a blur to Garima. The portscape leveled its descent and gradually slowed. The lighting through the screen returned to normal, and her helmet's protective layer became translucent again. The vessel was cutting a gentle path through the clouds. Under different circumstances, it would have been breathtakingly beautiful instead of terrifying. Even at this speed, the surface seemed to zoom up at her. From this height, she still knew these incredible giants of soil and stone before her, the Great Smoky Mountains. The familiarity brought a small sense of comfort, but she was still in dread, knowing all she could do was sit there and hope for the best. She grabbed the armrests in a vise-like grip. Garima heard some kind of thrusters fire, causing the vessel to rumble as it protested gravity itself. Seconds later, the initial hit nearly tore consciousness from her, even with the active lattice on all sides. The final collision sounded like a barrage of ancient cannon fire. It halted the portscape and abruptly threw her body forward, pushing her seat restraints to their limits. With so much pressure against her, she couldn't breathe. She wondered if her ribs were breaking, it hurt so much. She felt completely helpless, like a speck of dust in a hurricane. Then the control center ripped away from the rest of the craft, exposing the back to open air and flipping the section forward. The lattices immediately shorted out as the portscape lost all power. The rest of the frame, including the other core-weight bodies, tumbled away from the control center, triggering several small explosions as it fell out of view. Garima's elbow unintentionally hit the release button on the chair's armrest, and she was ejected from the rear of the control center. She hurled through the air and landed on her side, rolling a few times before her head slammed into the stony ground, cracking the front of the helmet. With the last of her strength, she pulled her helmet off and passed out. "She is stirring at last," a mid-tenor voice said. Garima opened her eyes. Her vision cleared, and she noticed the dark expanse with more stars than she had ever seen with her naked eyes. She noticed she was laying on blankets in the open. "Beautiful," Garima heard herself say. She sounded weak. "What do those stars mean to you?" the other woman interjected. "I heard you've always liked them." Her voice belonged to a type of being Garima didn't know, sitting next to her. Even illuminated only by natural light, Garima noticed that the woman was tall and had orange-hued skin. She also had long, maroon-colored hair tied back. Her eyes, easily twice normal size, had deep green pupils. Garima couldn't determine her age. Strangely enough, she also had a large jagged H scarring her left cheek. It did not look like a recent injury, or was it a tattoo? She was wearing a brown jacket, gray shirt, and dark blue pants. "What? Where?" Garima asked. "Welcome back, Garima," the other woman replied. "Your mission was a success, but you barely survived it. You've been in and out of consciousness for 2 days." The other woman walked into the tent and grabbed something. When she returned a moment later, she had a small gray bottle. An older human woman with dusty brown hair and dark clothing walked up and smiled when she made eye contact with Garima. She started to speak, but the orange-colored woman tapped her shoulder and shook her head. "Not now. For anyone. Until I say so," the orange woman quietly commanded. "Tell the others." The older woman looked slightly bewildered, but accepted it. "All right." She turned and entered the tent instead. The orange woman sat down next to Garima and helped her lift her head. She was glad to receive fresh water. When she was finished, the other woman gently released her. "Not up to talking?" she said to Garima. Garima wasn't sure what she should do, so she stayed quiet. A brunette-haired man, who was part human like Garima, approached the orange woman. He was also wearing dark clothing. "Ginevria, my team finished salvage on the Mishvar," the man reported. "We made it out with no problems. Actually, the military recovering operation should have arrived by now, but we saw no sign of them." "That is unusual. What could be more important than their new portscape?" she replied. "Still, this was noteworthy of your duties, Maltik. Tell the others we'll return to the caverns at first light." "I will," Maltik confirmed. He turned and walked in the direction he had come from, disappearing into the nearby woods. During the conversation, Garima had observed the two, especially Ginevria. She noticed additional scars on the woman's legs and arms. She also could see how physically strong she was. Ginevra radiated confidence and fighting experience. The stress line on Ginevra's forehead and below her eyes also revealed that she carried terrible burdens and had seen much loss. Rest some more. We leave in the morning, Ginevra said, crouching beside Garma. I need to contact your mother and let her know you're alive. Ginevra walked into the tent. Mother? Garma thought. Garma imagined her parents and family worrying about what had happened to her back home. Was her original body unconscious? Hospitalized? Was the other Garma awake in her body? That was too troubling to consider, so she blocked it out of her mind. She tried to shift positions, but she was stiff and sore all over. Some positions intensified her pain. Many of her efforts seemed futile, but she kept trying with whatever energy she had. During this time, she prayed for a way home, all the while fighting the growing sense of panic from being stranded here. Sleep did not come easily, but exhaustion and weakness eventually claimed her. Several hours later, Garma awoke. She wondered how her new body was so resilient. She was still sore all over, but her strength had returned and she felt more focused. She was also very hungry. It would be a few more hours before the sun rose and a chill was still in the air. She saw other people in dark shirts and pants like Maltics. Some were human, and the rest were like her. They were loading supplies into what appeared to be antique trucks, ones she had seen in photos from the 1950s and 1960s. She also comprehended that she was seeing such details clearly in the dark. She stood up, walked a few paces, and tried to get her bearings. Her center of gravity was more than a foot higher than she was used to, so even standing still was strange, awkward. She looked at her hands with the long palms and fingers once more. She slowly wrung those hands together. She put them behind her neck and felt how it was a few inches longer than the one she'd known all her life. She placed her fingers on both cheeks and traced downward until they met her chin. Everything made her want to run away from herself, but that wasn't possible. Everything working properly? Ginevra said from behind her. She turned around to face Ginevra, this alien stranger who knew her. Garma always felt shy around new people. Garma gently gripped her arms and forced herself to nod sheepishly. Ginevra scrutinized Garma with her eyes for several seconds. There was an intimidating hardness in that gaze. Are you hungry? There's food and water in the shelter, she told Garma, who nodded in response. They went inside the tent and sat on wooden stools at a small table where the produce was waiting. There were wooden crates filled with other supplies, 4 plastic gallon jugs of water, and a couple of other tables. Turning her attention to the food, the apples and grapes, she knew, but there was a blue rectangular fruit with smooth white stripes that was unfamiliar. It was softer and sweeter than the apples when she tasted it, which was surprising. There was a cold yellow soup with rice noodles and diced vegetables. As she took in a few spoonfuls, she recognized the tastes of celery, carrots, red onions, and potatoes. It had a spiciness to it as well for some black and cayenne peppers. As Garma ate, she also had 2 cups of water, which she poured from one of the jugs. Ginevra stood by silently the whole time, her mood a mystery. Are you well enough for a walk, Garma? I want to talk to you. Garma nodded nervously. The 2 left the shelter camp and traveled about a mile away in silence the entire time. They passed a field and entered a forest area before stopping at the base of a mountain. Ginevra pulled a short knife from her belt and threw it into the ground in front of Garma. Be very careful how you answer me next, and you'd better use words, Garma said slowly. Depending on what you say, you may need that blade. Garma was stunned. What? Who are you? And that's the end of part 1 of Singularity of Purpose. I hope you enjoyed this. We'll be reading part 2 on Wednesday, and I'll be very curious to get your feedback. Let me know if you liked this, if it intrigued you, and whether or not this might be interesting as a series. There's a lot more in part 2. So that's all I've got for now. Appreciate you joining me. and I'll see you next time.